Welcome to Charts Today. My name's David Linton, and today's edition for Monday, the 24th of June, comes to you from London. And the Federal Reserve comments last week about the likely move for interest rates in the US to be down, the next likely move, has really had a big impact on the markets over the week. And we saw the dollar really just falling away, 3 or 4 straight sessions of falls here. That shows up as a strong weekly down candle, meaning that we're seeing 3-month lows in the dollar taken as bearish on the short-term chart with downside targets, and the medium-term chart turning bearish as well. So the picture is changing quite significantly on the dollar. The euro actually rising quite strongly. We've got upside targets here as well. Remembering this is my long-term view, my medium-term and my short-term view. And if we look at the yen, the dollar-yen chart, where we tend to see the real relation showing, the real heads up on the dollar first, we're bearish on the long, medium and short term. So the outlook for the dollar is now changing quite significantly. Sterling sitting at 127 has had a good few days running against that higher dollar. The lower dollar, so sterling is actually looking a little bit higher, and against the euro, sterling is actually a little bit weaker with downside targets. And of course, a lot of political uncertainty still remains in the UK. This against the Swiss Franc, we're sitting at 124. That's showing the Swissy actually just gaining in strength, and against the Aussie dollar, 183. Bitcoin actually has broken the $10,000 level, so that's highly significant for Bitcoin. We saw that jump on the weekend to actually $11,000 at one point. We're now just flat on that short-term chart. We've got upside targets here. We've got 1 or 27%, and if we look at the shorter-term targets, we've got $11,500. But we are seeing a lot of action returning to the cryptocurrency, and it's looking stronger and stronger. The lagging line is right on resistance, but that Bitcoin recovery now looking pretty strong indeed. Stock markets took the Fed news positively as well. Lower interest rates normally means higher returns in equities. We saw that big weekly candle last week in the S&P 500, so looking quite strong. We were down slightly on Friday, but ended the week on a positive note. The Nasdaq yet to make a new high. The S&P 500 index is actually making a new all-time high, so that is quite significant. But the Nasdaq 100 index not quite there yet. And the Dow Jones also just struggling to just push to that new high, but we take heart from the fact that the S&P 500 index has done that. Of course, the Russell 2000, the broader-based US index, has much further to go. The S&P future is up 1/3% this morning, and the Nasdaq E-mini is up 0.44%, suggests that the US market will open higher. Looking at the UK market, we're up on the blue chip 100 index by 0.1%, and on the mid caps we're up by 0.3%. The DAX is down very slightly this morning, little change, but holding on to a strong week as well, and the CAC 40 is up 0.3%. Looking strongest of the markets in Europe, actually still just pushing above the cloud there. Japan was up very slightly. The Hang Seng was also up very slightly, and China was up 0.2%. Had a very strong week last week, the Chinese market, but interestingly, we've still got work to do to get back above the cloud on that lagging line on the long-term chart. India was down very slightly, still looking great with lots of upside targets. It's the one thing about India. Short term just turned a little bit bearish below the cloud there. The Aussie market was up 0.2%. And if we look to commodities now, Brent crude up 0.75% this morning, 65.68. The Iran troubles has really fueled a bit of a rise here in Brent crude. Medium and long term, we're still struggling, but we do now have upside targets, some 2, 3, 4% higher. So it does look like we will see the run in crude continue. And the same with WTI, only one lone upside target, 2.4% higher. But the chart is clearly short-term bullish. US nat gas sitting at $2.21. This chart not bullish at all, still pretty bearish, and that having an effect. The big news last week really was the massive breakout in the gold price. We've been talking about this for quite some time. We've now unwound all the downside targets on the long-term chart, and we are pushing for 1434. We've just this morning activated 1537, so looks like gold will run considerably higher from here. and silver also pushing higher as well. Taking and last of all, of course, US 10-year yields really sank last week. We're sitting at 2.05% this morning. We were on that 2% level. That is probably a support level that we just psychologically will keep an eye on, that 2% level. But US 10-year yields looking very bearish now on the medium and long-term charts, with downside targets into the sub 2% level. Taking a look now at the individual stocks, if we start by just looking at what happened on the US market on Friday, United Health was the best performer in the Dow. Interestingly, we've seen some pretty big performances here. Microsoft weren't up much on Friday, but making new all-time highs. So they're leading the tech sector there. If we look at Apple, on the other hand, Apple is yet to make new highs, so quite interesting there. And if we take, and DuPont was the worst performer. Looking at the Nasdaq, we had Facebook, they're up 0.8%, looking pretty stronger there. They've outperformed the market 23% this year on the Dow, so quite significant there. Looking at the Aussie market, the best performer was Ausdrill, and that's really breaking to bullish territory here. We've got an upside target, some 25% higher, so they're pushing higher there. And if we look on the downside, we had Metcash down 9%. That was a bit of a struggle, and Domain Holdings also just pushing lower as well. Looking at the Indian market, Lupin Limited, they're up 3.7%. UPL last week had quite a big fallback. We see the big weekly candle there. They've started this week on a much better note, up 4%, so quite key. Indiabulls Housing still looking pretty weak, even though they're on the leaderboard, and the same is true for Yes Bank. And if we look at the downside, we've got Oil and Gas Corporation down 3%, but the chart actually still holding up relatively well on the relative to the Dow Jones. They're just a few percent lower this year. Now, looking across to Europe, we've got the best performers in the UK market. Here we see the live prices coming in from Yahoo Finance. Emerald Group up 1.9% this morning. Not enough quite to get them bullish on the medium-term chart. Still underperforming the Dow Jones by 8% this year. If we look at the other side of the coin, we've got Carnival down 1.5%, Centrica down 1.12%. So still a lot of these charts, Centrica are underperforming the market by a massive 45% this year so far. In the mid-caps in the UK, if we look, first of all, we've got Entertainment One up 4.2%, so quite significant there. And if we look at the downside, we've got Amigo Holdings down 3.3%. So Dixon's Carphone had a terrible week last week. They're down a further 2% this morning. So really a very grim looking chart indeed. Underperforming the market by 25% this year. Taking a look at the European leaders, we've got Fresenius in Germany. They're up 1.2%. So looking pretty strong. Europe, you can see a sea of green here, looking pretty strong this morning. And the worst performer, Daimler, down 3%. So not looking good for Daimler shares. That's it for today. Until tomorrow, happy charting. See you then.